Right, so we're moving to our next presentation, and the next presentation will be about how not to become a prisoner under the investment agreement. And this session will be led by two lawyers, Łukasz Łyszczarek and Jędrzej Szymczyk from the Lewczuk, Łyszczarek and Partners.
Hello, my name is Łukasz Łyszczarek. I'm a partner at LLW law firm. Here with me is my colleague Jędrzej Szymczyk.
Hello.
We are both lawyers predominantly occupying with M&A and VC transactions. While working both with startups and VC funds, we have been in situations where either investor or funder got stuck in a relationship with no way out because of mistakes made at an early stage of the investment. Of different positions and expectations of both parties, we believe that paving the path properly at the beginning will facilitate the success at the end of the road for all of them. With this presentation, we would like to briefly jump through all key steps of almost every transaction. However, not for the purpose for describing of all of them, as it's obviously clear to all of us, but to indicate particular turning points in which which may hugely affect the future of the venture, and decide whether you become a prisoner or stay free. We will refer mostly to typical VC investments, not however forgetting about other means of external non-banking financing.
So the main question of our presentation is why the investor and the company relationship shall not be a prisoner relationship. At the same time, we need to ask whether shall it be a law affair or romance. Where is the balance between these two legal relationships, control, scope of rights, obligations? This question might seem to be absurd or strange, but it's really a practical problem. The way we structure the investment agreement or shareholders agreement, parties' rights, privileges, obligation, and goals basically will have a special impact on the company's development, future results, motivation of the founders and their involvement into the company, possible investment rounds, and of course the course of possible exit, investment exit. The way we structure these clauses will give us basically the answer whether this or the prison relationship. Which approach is correct? Probably, as you know, as usual, the solution is somewhere between that, somewhere in the middle. With a romantic legal situation, we have it at hand where there is no control of any kind from the investor side or on the company or the founders. There is no budget or financial plan approved by the investor. Company might take independent decisions in all company's operations and even the strategic ones. So all of that is based on the investment over trust and hope about future investment success of the company. In most cases, such over-trust relationship will end in not very well for the investors. In the other hand, we have the prison relationship situation in the investment. It is, I think, the most often associated with the investor's control in every aspect of the company's operation. For example, in the prison situation includes the requirement of investors' consent for every single activity, high sanctions, even for minor violations, investors' rights to appoint board member and the supervisory board member at the same time, and so on. The other clauses. The way we structure the privilege package of the investor, it might infect the company with such rights and privileges. So basically, how should it look like? Both the startup and the investor should have a clear path how they want to follow the cooperation during the investment period. They need to ask themselves what are the goals, what are the risks of achieving these goals, what kind of clauses mitigate these risks, what rights and obligation they need to have to be included to achieve these goals. So we can include only the privilege package which will be needed to achieve the goals of the investment policy of the investor. As you see on the slide, it seems to us that the situation of investment prisoner is more frightening, and unfortunately it happens more often in VC market. Funds commonly imply a lot of privileges into the company and block the company and their operations, the daily operations and business. As a result of that, at the first stage of the investment, the company certainly becomes a prisoner of the investor. But during the investment process, it might turn out that the investor becomes a prisoner of his own investment. For example, because the founders will lose their motivation to work, the company stops, and no one will be interested in another investment into the company round because this infection of the investor's package of rights and privileges. Basically, the risk of incorrect creation of the relationship between the investor and the company occurs at every stage of the investment. Starting with the conclusion of NDA and analysis of the NDA, going through the term sheet due diligence, and finishing on the exit and liquidation preference. Now Łukasz will tell more about early stage and risk associated with the initial analysis of the company.
Okay, initial analysis is the starting point for every investment. It's the first point where the founders of the company and the investors meet, and when they start to evaluate if there is any sense in making a common venture. So this is also the first point at which, from founder's perspective, you might get stuck in an unwanted relationship. So at this point, you should verify and decide what kind of financing, what kind of funding are you seeking for. For example, if your venture is meant to produce a predictable cash flow, you may consider debt financing, or at least a mixed financing instead of equity one. On the other hand, for projects like gaming, spin-offs, or one-off projects, you may look for a project financing, such as joint ventures or SPVs, with predefined revenue splits with potential investors, dependent on performance of the project. In this situation, it will let you keep control over the company and your core business, while providing sufficient funding for the project you would like to perform. And by this way, you don't get stuck with the new investors for a long term, instead of providing a reasonable return related to particular project. Whatever you decide with respect to the analysis, you may not forget that in each case there's a human being at the other end, and you need to include the role of each member of key personnel in the future venture, as well as include them in participation in both success and the failure of the project. Furthermore, that provisions with respect to members of key personnel should also leave sufficient space for future moves, such as follow-on investments, following rounds, or exit deals. Now, the next step on the line, we normally go to the NDA, where the most important thing is not to over-lawyer, because this will normally treated as a simple agreement that should not take too much time to move forward with. So if you go with like 15 pages, it takes too long, and all the parties get nervous with the process getting longer than they initially thought it will. Being stuck with the NDA will also cause the transaction to lose the required dynamics that the parties require to get the deal through in reasonable time. While drafting the NDA, you also need to remember that founder's IP and know-how is the most important information to be protected, and this may not be left over from the agreement. But on the other hand, you also need to remember that no NDA will give full protection against fraudulent or erroneous behavior. For that purpose, you need to build a professional team with access to information granted on a need-to-know basis. Otherwise, you might get enslaved by the knowledge gathered by a single individual. To make use of it otherwise than initially projected. Like moving to the next stage, we get to the point where the parties agree on a term sheet, which sets out the key terms of the proposed transaction. At this point, well, the most important thing to make it in general as a non-binding document, because still at that early stage of investment process, there is a lot of items that is left undecided. So make it binding with respect to the too wide scope may affect the future negotiation and position of the parties, which will have limited options with the terms that become binding merely under the term sheet. What is also important at that point is to secure a relevant exclusivity period in order to allow for appropriate preparation of the deal. During that time, the investor will usually conduct financial, tax, and legal due diligence, as well as arrange for drafting of the documentation required to finalize the deal. What you also need to remember is to remember about the rights and obligations of all the parties that will be involved in the binding documentation. As on the level of term sheet, it is common practice that only the company or one of the founders becomes a party thereof, and the parties agree that they will procure that other shareholders or partners of the project will be involved in the final documentation. Now moving forward to the due diligence process, you need to remember that well, having a possibility to conduct a full screening of the project should be treated as an opportunity rather than a pain in the ass and time-consuming obligation that at the point in order to verify the whole project. Furthermore, having red flag items during process is nothing unusual in early stage investment, and so, well, it is obvious that all efforts at the very beginning will be put in commercial development, R&D, etc., instead of getting stuck in the legal documentation. It may, however, have a huge impact on the venture's operations and position in the future. So you may not be able to cure certain transactions with board members or made unilaterally or referring to IP after you finalize the deal. It is therefore wise to find such red flags at the time in order not to get stuck in a deal that will not be fixable at a later stage. Please also remember that fund managers are usually spending, well, third-party money, and they also bear liability for lack of professional evaluation of each and every deal. This is of particular importance in case of state-funded or partially state-funded investment vehicles. Lately, we have heard about an investment made by a partially state-funded investment fund, in which the due diligence process was not duly conducted, and afterwards some charges with respect to criminal charges with respect to the founder came up, causing serious problems for the investors and for the public investor as well. Okay, let's get to the other part.
Yep. So let's go to the covenant because we don't have much time to present all of the slides. So let's be linked to the main question. So how the company may prevent from being a prisoner under performance of the covenant. I think that always the most problematic issue is the money payment. In many cases, the investment is released in tranches. For example, the tranches are linked to the milestone fulfillment. So basically, how should it look like to be fair, be not a prisoner? The payment of the investment tranches shall be mostly obligatory and shall be not considered as an option to the investor to invest at his own discretion. The tranches are released upon milestone fulfillment. The payment shall be obligatory if the milestones are met. In this situation, tranches might be optional only if the company does not basically meet the milestones. So this is the only one situation where the tranches may be not obligatory and stated as a call option for the investor. Having that in mind, please always remember that to include to the agreement a clear procedure of milestone assessment. Basically, one thing is the fulfillment of milestones, and the other is official confirmation of to the investor that the milestones are met and that the investors are obliged to make a payment. Secondly, please always keep in mind that the giving obligation to invest in tranches give more motivation to the founders, and they feel more comfortable with the financial situation of the company with the guarantee of receiving another tranche. Then let's go to the sanctions under the investment agreement. Sanctions to secure both positions, investor and the company, shall be implemented only in case of breach of the most important obligation or covenant. For example, it's a non-competition obligation. Another thing, we are not a fan of implementation to the investment agreement sanction mechanism under which the founder's share is reduced in some events, and at the same time the investor's share is increased.